Golden Doves, class 89. We're on page 47. The last class was really fascinating because we discussed how political authoritarian bodies, they want to subsume, put down the Hebrew idea of subjectivity, because subjectivity implies uniqueness and independence, and of course dictators, governments don't like that. We want to wrap up. I think we're going to be coming close to the end of this particular topic. So on page 47, at top of the page, in Hebrew, the expression of the subjective ego is the exclusive function of T. We said the suffix T, the pronominal suffix T, for example, in the verb achalti, so T expresses the subjective ego, the first person. And that's the only function of T. There is no other function of T, which implies the uniqueness of subjectivity. It means that at least for the Hebrew mind, this level of subjectivity cannot be expressed by an independent word. Why don't we have a word T, right? We don't have a word T. Because one can never understand the other person's subjectivity. We said that in the last class, right? Because every person is unique. Every person has unique thoughts, unique experiences, unique way of synthesizing those experiences. So T can only exist, the idea of subjectivity can only exist as part of a verb. Only when connected to a perfect verb, and it has to be a verb that already took place, right? Does a subjective ego find identity? Because in a verb that already took place, that's completed, we can, so to speak, have somehow a comprehension of that person. We don't really know that person, but we know the action that person just took because it's complete, right? So within the context of our purpose, it will suffice to point out that the concept, I misread. Within the context of our purpose, it will suffice to point out that the concept of subjective identity reflects the Semitic idea of a verb as a po'al, an action process. Though the verb represents an action or a process that took place, and that action or process, because it's a perfect verb, becomes objectified, and by connecting the T, the pronominal suffix T, to that objectified action, I can know something about the subjectivity of the person doing the action. He is a person who just said that he ate, ani achalti. He is a person who just said that he read, ani karati, right? And so on. Of course, I never know the T by itself, but I know the T in relation to the action that the T just did. You see, that's the extent. This is really deep, oh my gosh. Similarly, God, we only know God by his actions. You see? That's crazy stuff. We don't know what God is to himself, of course not. But we know what God does. So the Yad Midot tells us about what God does in the world. So you see the idea of T? Really deep stuff, and I'm sorry, I know I sound like I'm getting all excited, and you're like, what is he getting so excited about? This is great. This tells you the limits of human understanding and our inability to understand, of course, what God is. People always want to talk about the Godhead, whatever that nonsensical word means, right? You know, what is God, right? Well, in Hebrew thinking, you never really know the first person other than through the actions that the first person did. You know, I once had a discussion, this was many, many years ago. The U.S. Senate and the U.S. House of Representatives was historically very, very pro-Israel. So I was having a discussion with Israeli, and of course Israelis become very sensitive anytime you mention anything that chas v'shalom is somehow critical of the governmental system in Israel. I don't know why they're so sensitive, but I guess it's part of the Marxist culture. So I think in Marxism it was taboo to speak against the government, right? You had to love the government. I think a lot of that permeated modern Israel. And of course, I love Israel. I mean, please, wow, like, don't get me wrong, I love Eretz Israel, of course, needless to say. But it's infantile. Sometimes, it used to be, I don't know what it is like today, but it used to be that you're not allowed to criticize the state of Israel. It's perfect. I once had a discussion about somebody, well, you have 100% taxes on cars. Oh no, that's a good thing. So encourage people to take public transportation, which of course in Israel there is no adequate public transportation, but it's good to have 100% tax on cars. So, to buy a little teeny jalopy in Israel, you have to, I don't know, put the 24-month salary in. Anyway, so I had this discussion, getting back to the point of this class, sorry for the digression. But in this discussion, I was pointing out how the House of Representatives and the Senate were very pro-Israel, and how many people in the Knesset, unfortunately, were very anti-Israel at the time. So it was a conversation we were having, and the person I was speaking to, she pointed out, well, you don't really know what they think inside of themselves, right? It could be that they're really anti-Israel. They're just saying they're pro-Israel, right? I mean, it could be, right? Of course it could be. But here's the thing. We don't judge people by a mysterious, internal ego. What is he really thinking? We judge people by their actions, right? Al pi shenayim edim yakum davar means the edim don't have to read the person's mind. They have to see the person's actions, right? So we only judge a person by his external actions. That's the only way we could judge, right? So, do they really hate Israel? There was a senator who used to have a mezuzah, and I think he really did love Israel. He used to have some sort of mezuzah on his as a necklace to show allegiance to the Jewish people, He was always pro-Israel, supported funding for Israel, and did everything, all the actions were in support of Israel. So I don't need to read the person's mind in order to really say whether I should say thank you for your allegiance to the Jewish people. No, I can say thank you and feel quite comfortable with that thank you. Similarly, when there's an anti-Semite, maybe he really loves the Jewish people, but he's just acting like he hates. Again, this is nonsensical stuff. So you see, the Jewish approach is such an intelligent approach, right? The point being that we don't really understand God. We never can if we can't understand the reality of another individual. How can we ever really understand God? And that's why Harambam says in the Moreh, we understand God through his actions, because that's all we know about God. That's all we can possibly know about God, is what God does, right? His speech is part of his action, right? Ti and ta, continuing in the text. Ti and ta are not simultaneously possible, in the sense that there is either the first person speaking or the second person speaking. Of course, you have people fighting with each other. That's not speech. That's more like barking. So everybody's screaming at the same time, as you see on political shows. Again, Mechila, I know I sound like I'm anti-Israel. I'm not. But a lot of you used to have these political shows in Israel, Popolitika, where everybody's screaming at the same time. That's not speech. That's barking, right? But in speech, you either have ti, which is the first person saying ani achalti, or ta, which is the second person saying to the first person saying to the second person, you ate. You don't have the both at the same time. Silence, in the sense of active listening, and then between the ti, the first person speaking, and the ta, the second person, there's a pause. There's a silence. That's called active listening. This transforms the actual or potential ti into ta only by listening. Let's say that Reuven is speaking to Shimon. The Reuven tells Shimon, ani achalti. There's a pause. Shimon is listening. And now the ti becomes a ta, in the sense that Shimon understands something about the second person. Reuven can say, Ani achalti. And then Shimon can reply to Reuven, yes, ata achalta. I get it. I got the message. So you see the transformation of the T into the Ta. Conversely, speech transforms Ta into T. Right? And then there is a speech that can transform the Ta into T, because it could be, Shimon can start and say, Ata achalta, or Shimon sees that he's eating, and then the Reuven says, Ani achalti, right? So it goes both ways. It can start with Reuven to Shimon, back to Reuven. It could start with Shimon observing that he's eating, Ata achalta, and then Reuven says, Ani achalti. Thus, T and Ta, speech and silence, are two correlative terms expressing the dialectic reality of person, because that's what a person is. I either assert myself dialectically first as a first person, or maybe not first, and then as a second person. So there's this dialectical relationship. I exist vis-a-vis the other person. Interruption. There's always, again, the interruptions in speech signifies the distinctness and the possibility of transformation of these two terms. It's only because there's an interruption that there can be the transformation of T to Ta and Ta to T. Right? There has to be an interruption. If there's no interruption, then there's no speech. T can be said only to a person who can in turn address the speaker as Ta. I can't say T, for example, to let's say I had a pet, a gerbil. It doesn't mean Ani achalti. I can't say Ani achalti to the gerbil, because the gerbil can never process the idea of this is a first person, and I'm going to be the first person. A gerbil can't do that. A dog can't do that. A cat can't do that. Even a monkey can't do that. Only a human being has the ability of entering into that dialectical relationship of T, Ta, Ta, T, right? In this sense, interruption represents the ultimate ground of speech and subjectivity. Because you have interruption, you can have speech. And because you have interruption in speech, you can have subjectivity. There has to be an interruption between the T and the Ta, because those two things are never bridgeable. It's dialectical, it's not contiguous. The T doesn't just continue into the Ta. There has to be an interruption where the second person is listening, silence, processing. Then the second person replies. Referring to this basic concept, Blanchot wrote, and here's a quote: "The power to speak is interrupted, and this interruption plays a seemingly subordinate role." So you say, oh, well, what's interruption in speech? It's not important. It's a subordinate role. It just happens to be that when you speak, as you can tell I'm doing now, you have to have an interruption, so you can just say the words, but it's not significant, is it? That precisely of subordinated alternation. So Blanchot says the speech allows for an alternation between the speakers. By pausing, there can be an alternation between first and second person, where now the second person can alternate and become the first. So you need the interruption. A role, however, so mysterious, the role of silence is a very mysterious role, that it can be interpreted as carrying the mystery of language itself. It's in the interruption that you have the sodot of the language. Right? So you have syntax, which is how the sentence is built. But what allows for syntax is the interruption. There's commas, there's period, there's colons, there's semicolons. In the Torah you have ta'amim. So you have the syntax that's created by the ta'amim, and the ta'amim require interruptions, because it's in those silent pauses that the secret of meaning is hidden. Pause between phrases. Vaydaber Adonai El Moshe Lemor. So the pause, right? Bereshit, pause. Bara Elohim, pause. Et Hashamayim ve'et haaretz. So Bereshit, pause. There's a certain mystery to the word Bereshit. It's in the pause. A pause from one speaker to the other. Then you have the back and forth speak. You speak, Vayani Yov, Vayoma, and then the other one speaks. There's a pause, right? And pause of attention. I'm thinking about something, and then you speak. That's a pause of my attention, of understanding. So through the pause, I misspoke. It wasn't pause of attention, doesn't mean that. Pause of attention means because of the pause, I can now give attention to the words you just said. You just said something, I'm processing what you said, and then I understand what you said, which doubles the power of expression. Those pauses double the power. By the way, in the Torah, if the two letters are touching each other, Sefer Torah is pasul, because you need to have that pause. If the words are touching, of course, you have to have a slightly bigger space between the words. So between the letters, you need a pause, kahut ha'sa'ara. Between the words, you need a space, and between the words, you need a larger space. So the pauses is what contains the Sodot HaTorah. It's not subordinate, just like Blanchot says. It's essential. Interruption, and that's the end of the quote of Blanchot. Now back to my father's. Interruption is excluded in simultaneous analysis, but when you have a simultaneous composition, like a painting, everything is there at the same time, there is no pause. It's a different type of synthesis. It is both necessary and possible within the realm of successive analysis, but in successive synthesis, like in musical compositions, that's why rhythm is so important in a musical composition, because rhythm gives meaning, it gives syntax to the various notes. For if reality is to be apprehended serially, right? So in successive synthesis, you get bits and bits and bits of reality, one after the other after the other. It's a serial composition. Then the gaps makes becoming possible. So through the gaps, there is a synthesis of information. And that information can now be processed through the understanding inherent in the gaps. Like lightning puncturing the night, which Rambam talks about in the Monei Nevuchim. You have the lightning, and then you have the darkness. If it was always blinding light, there would be no understanding of that blinding light. But you have the darkness, and then maybe you have another lightning, and you put it together and you synthesize it. And pause of attention. Like the lightning, discontinuity assures continuity of understanding precisely because you have the interruptions, right? It's discontinuity. That's what allows you to have continuity of understanding. Without the discontinuity, you would never have the continuity of understanding.